Augusto's hands were still trembling when he finally stopped at the narrow doorway, his breath uneven, his heart refusing to slow down. The night had wrapped itself tightly around him, heavy and suffocating, as if the darkness itself had witnessed what had just happened and decided to follow him home. He could still feel the cold edge of the knife against his skin, still hear the stranger's voice, low, threatening and emotionless, echoing in his mind. It all felt unreal, like a scene from someone else's life. Yet the emptiness in his pockets and the tight knot in his chest reminded him that it was painfully real. He hadn't even realized how far he had walked until David gently placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him inside the apartment with a calmness that felt almost foreign in contrast to Augusto's chaos. The apartment was simple, but it felt safe. A warm yellow light filled the room, soft and steady, unlike the flickering streetlights outside. Augusto stood near the entrance for a moment, unsure of what to do, as if stepping further inside would make everything that had just happened sink in completely. David moved naturally through the space, as if he had done this 100 times before, helping someone, calming someone, being someone's unexpected refuge. He handed Augusto a glass of water without saying much, his quiet presence more comforting than any words could have been. Augusto took it with shaky hands, his fingers brushing briefly against David's, and for a second, the fear inside him loosened its grip. "Sit," David said softly, nodding toward the couch. His voice carried a warmth that didn't demand obedience but invited trust. Augusto obeyed, sinking into the cushions as if his body had finally given up holding itself together. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was healing. Outside, the city continued its restless rhythm, but inside, time seemed to slow, giving Augusto space to breathe again. He stared at the floor, replaying everything. The distraction of sending a message to his mother, the sudden presence behind him, the mask, the knife, the helplessness. A bitter laugh escaped his lips as he shook his head. "I didn't even finish paying," he muttered, more to himself than to David. David leaned against the wall, arms crossed loosely, watching him with quiet understanding. "What matters is that you're okay," he replied after a moment. "Phones can be replaced." It was a simple statement, but Augusto felt something in it. A reminder that he had survived, even if it didn't feel like enough. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "With what money?" he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I used everything I had just to get that one." His words carried more than just financial worry. They carried exhaustion, the weight of trying to stay afloat in a world that didn't seem to give him a break. David didn't interrupt. He just listened, and somehow that made Augusto feel seen in a way he hadn't expected. After a while, David stepped forward and sat across from him, his posture relaxed but attentive. "You'll figure it out," he said quietly. "You don't have to solve everything tonight." There was something about the way he said it, steady, certain, that made Augusto want to believe him. For the first time since the incident, the tightness in his chest eased just a little. When David offered his phone so Augusto could message his mother, there was no hesitation in his gesture. It wasn't just kindness, it was instinctive, genuine. Augusto hesitated for a moment before accepting it, his thoughts immediately turning to her. He imagined her reaction, her worry, the way her health made everything more fragile. "Maybe I shouldn't tell her," he murmured, more thinking out loud than asking for advice. David nodded slightly. "You know her best," he replied. "Sometimes it's okay to protect the people we love from things they don't need to carry." That simple understanding settled something inside Augusto. He typed a brief message, keeping it vague, telling her he would be staying out for the night. When there was no reply, he felt both relief and a strange kind of loneliness. He handed the phone back slowly, his fingers lingering for a second longer than necessary. "Thanks," he said quietly. The night had grown deeper by then, the silence outside turning heavier, more uncertain. Augusto shifted uncomfortably. "I should go," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The idea of stepping back into that darkness made his chest tighten again. David noticed it immediately. "You don't have to," he said gently. "Stay here tonight." There was no pressure in his tone, just sincerity. It's safer. And you look exhausted. Augusto looked at him, really looked at him this time. There was something reassuring about David's presence. Something steady, grounding. He wasn't overly expressive, yet everything he did spoke of quiet care. Are you sure? Augusto asked, unsure if he was imposing. David smiled faintly. I wouldn't offer if I wasn't. Something shifted in that moment. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but subtle and real. Augusto nodded slowly, as if making a decision that went beyond just staying the night. Okay, he said. David stood up and moved toward a small hallway. I'll get you a towel, he said. You should take a shower. It might help. Augusto watched him go, feeling an unfamiliar sense of calm beginning to settle over him. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled him the same way. Instead, there was something else now, something softer, quieter. As the sound of running water filled the bathroom moments later, Augusto leaned back against the couch, closing his eyes. The events of the night still lingered in his mind, but they were no longer the only thing he could feel. There was also the warmth of the apartment, the kindness of a stranger, and the strange, unexpected comfort of not being alone. And somewhere, beneath the exhaustion and the fading fear, something new had begun. Something neither of them had yet put into words, but both could already feel. The sound of water falling against the tiled floor echoed softly through the apartment, wrapping the space in a calm, almost hypnotic rhythm. Augusto stood under the warm stream, his eyes closed, letting the heat run down his shoulders as if it could wash away everything that had happened that night. For a moment, he allowed himself to forget the fear, the knife, the helplessness. The water carried with it a strange sense of renewal, like he was shedding not just the dirt and sweat of the day, but also the weight that had settled deep inside him. He ran his hands through his hair, exhaling slowly, and for the first time since the incident, his breathing felt steady again. Yet even in that fragile peace, his thoughts kept drifting back, not to the robbery, but to David. There was something about him that didn't make sense in the best possible way. In a world that had just shown Augusto its harshest side, David had appeared like a quiet contradiction, gentle, patient, and unexpectedly kind. Augusto found himself replaying small moments in his mind. The way David had handed him the glass of water, the softness in his voice, the way his eyes seemed to listen even more than his words. It wasn't just gratitude that Augusto felt. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite define yet, but it lingered in his chest with a warmth that refused to fade. He shook his head slightly, as if trying to clear the thought, but it only made him more aware of it. When he finally stepped out of the shower, the cool air of the room brushed against his skin, sending a slight shiver down his spine. He wrapped the towel around his waist and stared at his reflection in the mirror for a moment. His face looked different. Tired, yes, but softer somehow, as if the sharp edges of fear had been gently smoothed out. He touched his cheek absent-mindedly, then let out a quiet sigh. "You're okay," he whispered to himself, as if he needed to hear it out loud to believe it. As Augusto stepped back into the living room, he found David leaning casually against the kitchen counter, preparing something simple. The soft clinking of dishes and the faint aroma of coffee filled the air, creating a sense of normalcy that felt almost surreal after everything that had happened. David looked up as soon as he noticed Augusto, his eyes lingering for a second longer than necessary before he smiled lightly. "Feeling better?" he asked. Augusto nodded, though his gaze dropped briefly, a hint of shyness creeping in. "Yeah, a lot better," he replied. There was a pause, brief but filled with something unspoken. Augusto became suddenly aware of himself, of the way the towel sat loosely around his waist, of the droplets of water still tracing lines down his skin. He shifted slightly, unsure of what to do with the sudden tension that wasn't fear this time, but something softer, something warmer. David seemed to notice it too, though he didn't say anything directly. Instead, he turned his attention back to the counter, giving Augusto a moment to breathe. "There's a spare shirt on the chair," he said casually. "You can use it." His tone was gentle, but there was something in it, a quiet care that didn't need to be emphasized. Augusto followed his gaze and found the neatly folded clothes waiting for him. It was such a small gesture, yet it made something in his chest tighten again, not from anxiety, but from a growing sense of appreciation that was starting to feel personal. After getting dressed, Augusto walked slowly toward the kitchen, drawn by the comforting smell. He leaned slightly against the counter, watching David move with ease. "You didn't have to do all this," he said quietly. David shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I wanted to," he replied simply. And that was it, no big explanation, no attempt to make it sound like anything more than it was. But somehow that made it feel like everything. They ate together in a comfortable silence at first, the kind that didn't demand conversation. Augusto found himself studying David without meaning to. The way he held his cup, the way his expression softened when he listened, the small, almost imperceptible smiles that came and went. There was a quiet confidence about him, but it wasn't overwhelming. It was grounding, steady, like someone who knew how to exist in the moment without rushing it. "So, what were you doing out so late?" Augusto asked after a while, his curiosity finally finding its voice. David leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. "Trying to clear my head," he admitted. "College stuff. I didn't do well this semester." There was no self-pity in his tone, just honesty. Augusto tilted his head slightly. "That doesn't sound like you," he said before he could stop himself. David raised an eyebrow, amused. "And what does someone like me sound like?" he asked. Augusto hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Someone who has things figured out," he replied. David chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Trust me, I don't," he said. "I'm just figuring it out as I go." There was something reassuring in that admission, something that made Augusto feel less alone in his own uncertainty. The conversation flowed more easily after that, moving from small topics to deeper ones without either of them realizing how much time had passed. They talked about fears, about expectations, about the strange pressure of trying to become someone while still not knowing who that someone was supposed to be. And somewhere in between those words, something began to shift again. Something quiet but undeniable. At one point, their hands brushed accidentally while reaching for the same cup. Both of them paused just for a second, but it was enough. Augusto felt a small spark run through him, subtle but impossible to ignore. He looked up, meeting David's eyes, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no fear in that silence, only a growing awareness of something neither of them had planned, yet neither seemed willing to pull away from. Later, as the night deepened and exhaustion finally began to settle in again, David gestured toward the bed. "You should rest," he said softly. Augusto hesitated, standing there for a moment as if deciding something important. "Will you stay?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. David looked at him, really looked at him, and something in his expression softened even more. "Yeah," he replied gently. "I'll stay." As they lay down, the distance between them felt smaller than it should have been for two people who had just met. The room was dim, the only light coming from a faint glow outside the window. Augusto turned slightly, his back to David at first, but he could feel his presence behind him. Steady, warm, real. It was comforting in a way he hadn't expected. "Everything will be okay," David murmured softly. And this time, Augusto believed it not just because of the words, but because of the way they were said. Slowly, as sleep finally began to take over, the memories of fear faded into the background, replaced by something else entirely. Morning arrived quietly, slipping into the room through the thin curtains in soft streaks of golden light. Augusto stirred first, his eyes opening slowly as he adjusted to the unfamiliar surroundings. For a brief second, confusion flickered across his face, but then the memories returned, not all at once, but gently. The robbery, the fear, the long walk, and then David. His gaze shifted slightly, and that's when he noticed him. Lying just a little distance away, still asleep, his face relaxed in a way that made him look younger, softer, almost untouched by the worries he had spoken about the night before. Augusto didn't move immediately. Instead, he found himself watching him, quietly, as if afraid that even the smallest movement might break something fragile. There was something peaceful about that moment, something that made everything else feel distant. The chaos of the night before seemed like it belonged to another world entirely. Here, in this quiet room, there was only warmth, calm, and the soft sound of David's breathing. Augusto exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling more evenly than it had in hours. He didn't realize it yet, but for the first time in a long time he felt safe. Carefully, trying not to wake him, Augusto shifted slightly, sitting up on the edge of the bed. His body still carried traces of exhaustion, but his mind felt lighter. As he ran a hand through his hair, he caught himself smiling faintly, an unexpected, almost shy smile that appeared without permission. He glanced back one more time before standing, his eyes lingering on David for just a moment longer than necessary. There was a quiet gratitude in that look, but also something else, something deeper that had started to take root. The smell of coffee soon filled the apartment, rich and inviting. Augusto followed it into the small kitchen, where he found David already awake, moving around with an ease that made it seem like he had been up for a while. "Good morning," David said, glancing over his shoulder with a soft smile. Augusto hesitated for a second, then returned it. "Morning," he replied, his voice still carrying the warmth of sleep. "You said you'd help me sleep," Augusto added lightly as he leaned against the counter. David chuckled softly, handing him a cup of coffee. "And you did sleep, didn't you?" he teased. Augusto took the cup, their fingers brushing again, and this time neither of them pulled away immediately. "I guess I did," Augusto admitted, his voice quieter now, as if the moment had shifted into something more delicate. They moved around each other in the kitchen with a growing familiarity that felt almost surprising. It hadn't even been a full day since they met, yet there was a comfort between them that people often took months to build. Augusto found himself noticing little things, the way David hummed softly under his breath while preparing breakfast, the way his movements were unhurried, the way he seemed fully present in everything he did. It was calming, grounding. "Try this," David said, placing a simple sandwich in front of him. "It's my favorite." Augusto raised an eyebrow playfully. "If I don't like it, I'm blaming you," he replied. David laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Fair enough." As they sat together, eating and talking about small things, Augusto felt something inside him begin to settle in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about feeling better after what had happened. It was about feeling connected, understood, seen. And the more time he spent with David, the more that feeling grew, quietly but steadily. Then, almost as if reality decided to remind them of itself, David spoke again. "Your mother texted," he said, picking up his phone. Augusto's expression changed instantly, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "What did she say?" he asked quickly. David handed him the phone. "She just wanted to know if you were okay." Relief washed over Augusto as he read the message. "She thinks I just stayed over at a friend's place," he said softly. "That's probably better." David nodded in agreement. "Sometimes it's easier that way." There was a brief silence after that, but it wasn't heavy, it was thoughtful. Augusto stared at the phone for a moment longer before something crossed his mind. "Can I try calling it?" he asked suddenly. "My phone, I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe someone found it." There was a hint of hope in his voice, fragile but real. David hesitated for just a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yeah, sure," he said, though something in his tone shifted ever so slightly. Augusto didn't notice. He dialed the number, holding the phone close to his ear as the ringing sound filled the space between them. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint, unmistakable sound echoed from somewhere inside the apartment. Augusto froze. The ringing wasn't coming from far away. It wasn't distant or unclear. It was close, too close. His eyes slowly lifted, scanning the room, his heart beginning to beat faster. Not from fear this time, but from confusion. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. David's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Hear what?" he replied, though his eyes had already begun to shift, searching. The ringing continued, and then Augusto turned toward the hallway. Without saying a word, he began to walk slowly, each step heavier than the last. The sound grew clearer with every step, leading him toward a partially open door. His hand hesitated on the handle for a brief moment before pushing it open. The sound was louder now, clear, unmistakable, and there, on a small table inside the room, his phone. Augusto stared at it, his mind struggling to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. The ringing stopped, leaving behind a silence so sharp it almost hurt. Slowly, he turned back toward David, his expression no longer soft, no longer calm. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with something far heavier than before. David stood frozen in place, the warmth that once filled the room now replaced with tension that neither of them could ignore. And just like that, the fragile piece they had built together began to crack, leaving behind questions neither of them were ready to answer, and feelings that suddenly felt much more complicated than they had just moments ago. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything Augusto had experienced the night before. It wasn't loud or chaotic like fear. It was sharp, suffocating, and filled with questions that refused to stay quiet. Augusto stood there, his phone still lying on the table behind him, as if it had suddenly become something unfamiliar, something dangerous. His eyes remained fixed on David, searching his face for answers, for any sign that could explain what didn't make sense. "Say something?" Augusto finally whispered, his voice trembling, not with fear this time, but with hurt. "How is my phone here?" The words hung in the air, fragile but demanding. David shook his head slowly, taking a small step forward. "I don't know," he said, his voice steady but softer than before. "Augusto, listen to me. I swear I don't know how it got there." His eyes held sincerity, but in that moment, sincerity wasn't enough. Not against what Augusto had just seen. Augusto let out a bitter laugh, running a hand over his face as he turned away for a second. "You don't know?" he repeated, his tone rising slightly. "I get robbed, I end up here, and suddenly my phone is inside your apartment? And you don't know." He turned back again, his expression now a mix of disbelief and pain. "Do you realize how that sounds?" David didn't interrupt. He let Augusto speak, let him release everything that had been building inside him. Because deep down he knew, if their roles were reversed, he would feel the same. "I trusted you," Augusto continued, his voice quieter now but heavier. "I stayed here because I felt safe, because I thought—" He stopped himself, the words catching in his throat. "Because I thought you were different," he wanted to say, but he couldn't finish it. David took another step closer, carefully, as if approaching something fragile. "And you were right to feel safe," he said gently. "I didn't do this to you." There was no hesitation in his voice, no defensiveness, just quiet certainty. "Think about it. I was with you the whole time after we met. I didn't leave your side." Augusto's gaze wavered for a moment. He knew that was true. He remembered it clearly. David had been there, calm, present, constant. But the image of his phone sitting in that room refused to disappear. "Then how?" he asked, almost helplessly. "Explain it to me." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt fragile again, but this time in a different way. Not soft, not warm, but tense and uncertain. And then David exhaled slowly, as if something had just clicked in his mind. Vaguinho. The name landed between them like a missing piece finally finding its place. Augusto frowned slightly. "Your roommate?" he asked. David nodded, his expression tightening. "He left before I found you last night," he explained. "And when we got back, he wasn't here." He paused, thinking it through. "I told you he comes home late. It wouldn't be the first time he showed up at strange hours." Augusto's eyes shifted slightly, the anger in them softening just a little, replaced by uncertainty. "You think he did it?" he asked. David ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping into his features. "I don't want to believe it," he admitted, "but it's the only thing that makes sense." He looked back at Augusto, his gaze steady again. And if it's true, then I'm sorry. Not because I did anything, but because I brought you into a place where this could happen. That sentence changed something. Not everything, but something. Augusto's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension in his body easing just a fraction. He looked down for a moment, processing everything, trying to separate what he felt from what he knew. I don't know what to think, he admitted quietly. That's okay, David replied just as softly. You don't have to figure it out right now. But Augusto shook his head slightly. No, I should have trusted you, he said, his voice filled with regret. After everything you did for me last night, He stopped again, frustrated with himself now. I panicked. David stepped closer, this time without hesitation. You were scared, he said gently. Anyone would have reacted the same way. There was no blame in his tone, no resentment, only understanding. Augusto looked up at him, really looked at him again, and this time he saw what he hadn't been able to see before. The same calm presence, the same quiet honesty. It hadn't changed, not even after the accusation. I'm sorry, Augusto said, the words coming out more easily now. David smiled faintly, shaking his head. You don't have to apologize for feeling something real, he replied. Just don't shut me out because of it. There was a pause, a softer one this time, and then Augusto took a small step forward. I don't want to, he admitted. The distance between them closed again, not suddenly, not dramatically, but naturally, like something finding its way back to where it belonged. The tension hadn't disappeared completely, but it had shifted, softened, transformed into something more honest. I'll talk to him, David said after a moment, his voice more firm now. If Fuguinho had anything to do with this, I'll handle it. You won't have to deal with him again. Augusto nodded slowly. Thank you, he said. And this time, the gratitude in his voice was deeper than before. There was still uncertainty, still questions that needed answers, but the connection between them hadn't broken. If anything, it had been tested, and somehow it remained. And as they stood there, closer than before, something else lingered in the air. Not just relief, not just understanding, but the quiet realization that whatever had started between them the night before was still there, still real, and maybe even stronger now. The apartment felt different after that moment, quieter, heavier, but also more honest. The fragile illusion of a perfect night had been broken, yet what remained between them felt more real than before. Augusto stood by the window for a while, staring out at the waking city, his thoughts tangled but slowly beginning to settle. The fear from the robbery had faded into the background, replaced by something far more complicated. Trust, doubt, and a connection he didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. Behind him, David moved through the apartment with a new kind of focus. His calm demeanor was still there, but now it carried a sharper edge, a quiet determination that hadn't been visible before. He grabbed his phone, his jaw tightening slightly as he dialed a number. Augusto turned just enough to notice, his attention shifting back inside. Fuguinho, David said when the call connected, his tone controlled but firm. We need to talk. There was a pause. Then something shifted in his expression. Irritation, maybe even anger. No, don't play dumb with me. I found things here. A bag, other people's stuff, and a knife. His voice lowered, but the intensity remained. You crossed a line. Augusto felt a chill run through him at the mention of the knife. The image from the night before flashed briefly in his mind, but this time it didn't hold the same power. Not with David standing there, facing it head-on. I don't care what you say, David continued, cutting off whatever excuse was coming from the other side. You need to come back and explain yourself or don't come back at all. Either way, I'm done covering for you. And with that, he ended the call, letting out a slow breath as he lowered the phone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Augusto stepped closer. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. You could have just let it go. David shook his head immediately. No, he replied. Not after what happened to you. And not if he's been doing this to other people too. He paused, his gaze softening as he looked at Augusto. You deserve better than that. Those words settled deeply. Augusto wasn't used to hearing things like that, not in a way that felt genuine. He looked down briefly, then back up again, his expression softer now. You barely know me, he said, almost as if questioning it. David gave a small, almost amused smile. Maybe, he said, but I know enough. There was something in the way he said it, simple, certain, that made Augusto's chest tighten again, but not in a painful way. It was something warmer, something that made him feel seen without needing to explain himself. Time passed quietly after that. The tension didn't disappear completely, but it no longer controlled the space between them. Instead, it blended into something more balanced, real, imperfect, but still meaningful. Later, as the morning stretched into afternoon, Augusto found himself sitting on the couch while David tuned his guitar nearby. The soft sound of strings being adjusted filled the room, creating a calm that felt almost therapeutic. Augusto watched him for a moment before speaking. You said you'd play for me, he reminded him, a faint smile appearing. David glanced up, returning the smile. I did, he said. Still want to hear it? Augusto nodded. David adjusted his position, his fingers settling on the strings with a familiarity that spoke of years of quiet practice. Then he began to play. The melody was soft at first, gentle, almost hesitant, but it grew steadier with each passing note. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. There was emotion in it, something raw and unfiltered that reached Augusto in a way words couldn't. He leaned back slightly, letting the sound wrap around him, letting it fill the spaces that had felt empty just hours before. And then David started to sing. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a quiet intensity that made every word feel personal. The lyrics spoke of longing, of time lost and found again, of wanting someone without fear or hesitation. Augusto felt his breath catch slightly as he listened, his eyes never leaving David. It didn't feel like just a song, felt like a confession. When the music finally faded, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything that hadn't been said. Augusto sat there for a moment, processing it, feeling it. That was, he started, then stopped, unable to find the right word. David smiled faintly. Yeah, he said, as if he understood anyway. Augusto stood slowly, closing the distance between them without fully realizing it. You're really good, he said, his voice softer now. Thanks, David replied, his gaze holding his. There was a pause, one that stretched just long enough to become something else. Something heavier, something undeniable. Augusto's hand lifted slightly, almost uncertain at first, before gently brushing against David's arm. It was a small gesture, but it carried everything, the gratitude, the apology, the connection that had grown between them in such a short time. David didn't pull away. Instead, he stepped just a little closer. Their eyes met again, and this time, neither of them looked away. About earlier, Augusto began, his voice barely above a whisper. I meant what I said. I don't want to lose this, whatever this is. David's expression softened even more. You won't, he replied quietly. And in that moment, the distance between them disappeared completely. There was no rush, no urgency. Just a quiet understanding as they moved closer, as if both of them were giving the other time to step back if they wanted to. But neither of them did. Augusto's hand found David's, their fingers intertwining naturally, like they had done it before. The contact sent a warmth through both of them, steady and real. Stay, David murmured softly. Augusto nodded. I'm not going anywhere. And as they stood there, in the middle of a day that had begun with uncertainty and tension, something else finally took its place. Not just relief, not just trust, but the quiet beginning of something deeper, something neither of them could ignore anymore. The afternoon slowly melted into evening, and with it came a softness that neither Augusto nor David tried to resist anymore. The sunlight that once filled the room had faded into warm shadows, and the quiet hum of the city outside felt distant, almost irrelevant. Inside the apartment, everything had settled. Not into silence, but into a calm understanding that no longer needed constant words. Augusto remained close to David, their hands still loosely intertwined, as if neither of them wanted to break the connection that had grown so naturally between them. There was something different now. The fear, the confusion, the misunderstandings, they hadn't completely disappeared, but they no longer defined the moment. Instead, they had become part of the story that led them here. And somehow, that made everything feel more meaningful, more real. "You're still thinking," David said softly, noticing the way Augusto's gaze drifted slightly, as if caught between the present and something deeper. Augusto exhaled slowly, a faint smile forming on his lips. "Yeah," he admitted, "but not about what you think." He turned his head just enough to meet David's eyes. "I was just wondering how something so bad led me to something like this." David didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at him, taking in the honesty in his expression. Then gently he squeezed Augusto's hand. "Sometimes life works like that," he said quietly. "It breaks something, just to show you something else." Augusto let those words settle, feeling their weight in a way that was both comforting and overwhelming. He stepped a little closer, their shoulders brushing lightly now, the space between them almost non-existent. "I'm glad it happened," he said after a moment. David raised an eyebrow slightly. "You're glad you got robbed?" he teased gently. Augusto shook his head, a soft laugh escaping him. "No," he said. "I'm glad I found you. That changed everything." The air shifted again, but this time there was no tension, no hesitation. Only something warm, certain, and impossible to ignore. David's expression softened in a way Augusto hadn't seen before, something deeper than kindness, deeper than care. It was something that reflected back everything Augusto was feeling but hadn't fully said out loud yet. "You already had me," David replied quietly. And that was it, the last wall between them, gone without force, without fear. Augusto's hand moved slightly, resting more firmly against David's, his thumb brushing gently against his skin. It was a small gesture, but it carried everything they hadn't been able to express before. David responded instinctively, his other hand lifting to rest lightly against Augusto's arm, grounding him, holding him there in the moment. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. Their closeness grew naturally, slowly, like something unfolding exactly the way it was meant to. Augusto's gaze dropped briefly to David's lips before returning to his eyes, silently asking a question he didn't have to speak. And David answered it the same way by not stepping back. When they finally leaned in, it wasn't sudden or overwhelming. It was soft, careful, almost hesitant at first, as if both of them understood the importance of the moment. Their foreheads brushed lightly before their lips met, a quiet connection that felt less like a beginning and more like something that had been building all along. There was no urgency in it, only warmth, only truth. When they pulled back slightly, neither of them moved far. Their breaths still mixed, their foreheads still close, their eyes still searching each other. Not for answers anymore, but for reassurance that what they felt was real. "It's strange," Augusto whispered. "What is?" David asked softly. "How fast this happened," Augusto replied, "and how right it feels." David smiled, his thumb brushing lightly against Augusto's hand again. "Not everything real takes time," he said. "Some things just happen when they're supposed to." Augusto nodded slowly, understanding that in a way he couldn't fully explain. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't overthinking. He wasn't trying to control what came next or question whether it would last. He was simply there, in the moment, with someone who made everything feel lighter. Outside, the night had fully taken over, the city lights glowing faintly through the window. But inside, there was a different kind of light, something softer, quieter, but far more meaningful. Augusto leaned his head lightly against David's shoulder, closing his eyes for a moment. "I was so scared yesterday," he admitted quietly. David turned slightly, resting his head gently against Augusto's. "You're safe now," he said. And this time, Augusto didn't just believe it. He felt it. Not because the world had suddenly become safer, but because he wasn't facing it alone anymore. Minutes passed, or maybe longer, it didn't matter. Time had lost its urgency, replaced by something steadier, something that didn't need to be measured. Eventually, Augusto lifted his head slightly, looking at David with a softness that hadn't been there before. "So what happens now?" he asked. David met his gaze, calm and certain. "Now?" he repeated softly. "Now we see where this goes." There was no promise of perfection in his words, no guarantee of what the future would bring. But there was honesty, and sometimes that was enough. Augusto smiled. And this time it wasn't hesitant or uncertain. It was real. He tightened his hold on David's hand just slightly, as if sealing something unspoken between them. "Then I'm staying," he said. David's smile mirrored his. "Good," he replied. And as the night wrapped around them once more, it no longer felt heavy or uncertain. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something. Something built not on perfect circumstances, but on trust, understanding, and a connection that had survived doubt, fear, and truth. A night that had started with darkness had led them here, to warmth, to closeness, to each other. And for the first time, neither of them was afraid of what came next.